Good morning, friends. Last week, our county executive, Mark Elrich, sent out a letter to the local community reminding us that May 16, which was this past Tuesday, is the International Day of Living Together in Peace. I'll be honest with you, I didn't even know that that day was a thing. I looked it up. It's created by the United Nations, and it's a time to invite nations to work toward greater solidarity and to increase goodness and to stand against hate and intolerance. Elrich used the opportunity to speak to us about the alarming uptick in acts and rhetoric of hate in our own community. And he invited leaders and community members to speak up and to remind about the importance of not just leaving the work of peacemaking to those who are elected, but that it's on all of us to make sure to cut hatred at its root. And it's so true, friends, that hatred doesn't start with its most extreme expressions. But it starts in the little seeds of intolerance that eventually lead up to that. So jokes or comments that are made behind closed doors or among friends at school that seem to prejudice against groups of people, whether it's certain sexual orientations or religious groups or ethnic groups or whatever it is. And eventually those things build up, and it's the subconscious escalation that eventually leads to places where we are consciously doing things that are super intolerant and actually hurt others. And so I was reminded as I was reading this letter by Elrich, I was reminded of the story in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, where the disciples ask Jesus if they could call down balls of fire from heaven to consume the Samaritans. Samaritans were the enemies of the Jewish people in those days. And I kind of saw this story in a new way, because if you think about Jesus he was born into a very particular time and a particular ethnic group, religious group that had its own prescribed enemies. So Jesus grew up around the rhetoric of the Samaritan being the enemy. And here Jesus is in Samaria, and we're told that the Samaritans rejected Jesus. And the disciples wanted to use this opportunity to kind of get God on their side, targeting the Samaritans, their enemies. And I think about how often when there is intolerance and acts of hate or even just subconscious prejudices, how somewhere deep down inside we want to believe that God is on our side, that we're maybe even, unfortunately, doing God a favor in our intolerance of the other. And we're told that Jesus immediately rebukes the disciples, and they move on. And it's kind of a humorous story in a sense of how obtuse the disciples can be, that they would actually ask Jesus if they could call down fire to consume these people. It's like they've heard nothing that Jesus has ever taught. But it's also a really sobering story, that those who walked most closely with Jesus, even they were susceptible to thinking that God would destroy their enemies. And so for me, as a religious leader, as a Christian, I don't want to pretend that being a follower of Christ means automatically that there's no hatred or no prejudice. Because if Jesus' own disciples who walked with him, lived with him, heard his teachings, if they had the capacity to still think that it was okay for God to destroy their enemies, then how much more are we susceptible to that? So this is something that we have to watch, that we have to be mindful of, that we have to be vigilant in, is reminding ourselves that God does not tolerate intolerance, that what we're called to is love. And I want to just end today this kind of brief thought with a quote that I found by Martin Luther King, and it's one that I hadn't come across before. This is a book called Prayers for Peace. Sorry, I took the thing off. Prayers for Peace, and it's from different traditions, but there is this one quote by MLK on love, and I just want to read it and pause with you for a second as we think about this. But he says, in the final analysis, love is not this sentimental thing that we talk about. It's not merely an emotional something. Love is creative, understanding goodwill for all men. It is, and this is the part that I want you to hear, it is the refusal to defeat any individual. That's really amazing, especially here in a very competitive area in DC. When you rise to the level of love, King says, of its great beauty and power, you seek only to defeat evil systems. Individuals who happen to be caught up in that system, you love, but you seek to defeat the system. And so I want to remind us today, in these beautiful words by MLK Jr., is that we are called no matter what, even in our fight against injustice and against systems that oppress. We're called no matter what to love even those who are wrapped up in the system. So even those who perpetuate acts of hate on an individual level, or those who do it on a systemic level, we're called to love the individual, but we're called to work passionately against the system that oppresses or marginalizes. And so, friends, let us continue as followers of Christ to remember that Jesus said no when it came to doing or thinking evil of the enemy. Jesus said no to that. He invited us to be peacemakers, and he invited us to love. And what love is not just an emotion. Love is a very intentional act of standing against those things that make us less than who God created us to be. I love you, St. John's. Thank you for being the community that you are, and I look forward to seeing you this Sunday.